Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join the SQFI team for our Learning Lunch webinar. My name is Sarah Milenich. I'm the Senior Sales and Marketing Manager here, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Our discussion today on preparing for FSMA the SQF way is presented by Leanne Chuboff, who is the Senior Technical Director here at SQFI, and Brian Armentrout, who is the CEO of the Food Leadership Group. Additionally, today's webinar is sponsored by Hillbrush. The rules and implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act are on everyone's minds, hence why you're probably on this webinar today. Sorting through the FSMA final rules can be time-consuming and a confusing task. We've put together our FSMA resource page to help you understand the legal and regulatory complexities of FSMA while alleviating some pain points our stakeholders are struggling with regarding implementation and execution. Brian and Leanne are going to talk to you about two major important things that are on this FSMA resource page. The Atchison Group comparisons, as well as our voluntary preventive control audit checklist and guidance documents. An annual 4-hour SQF professional update is required for re-registration of all SQF professionals. However, any SQF stakeholder may participate. Most frequently held as a webinar, the updates are held at least 4 times per year. Topics covered typically include updates to the SQF program, current results from the compliance and integrity programs, training program updates, enhancement to the SQF assessment database, and a GFSI benchmarking status report for key modules, and the status of key SQF documents. We encourage all registered SQF professionals to sign up for one of the dates posted well before the registration expiration date. We have 2 specialized auditor trainings that we offer. The first is the SQF Packaging Auditor Training class, which is a 3-day packaging auditor training program designed for the candidate seeking qualification to conduct SQFI certification audits to Food Sector Category 27. And the other is the SQFI Ethical Sourcing Standard auditor training. The SQFI Ethical Sourcing Standard provides a core set of requirements that provide a facility with the environmental, health and safety management systems to demonstrate a commitment to environmental control and social compliance. For more information about our training classes and programs, please visit SQFI.com and click on the SQF Professional tab and Events tab to register. Have you registered for the SQF Conference, October 25th through 27th in Orlando yet? If not, what are you waiting for? It's going to be fabulous. This is designed and developed by your peers in the food safety industry. The annual SQF International Conference provides a unique and valuable opportunity to gain knowledge and skills to strengthen your food safety and food quality assurance programs. The conference will increase your ability to protect your consumers' branding and bottom line and ensure that you and your company are fully prepared to implement SQF code changes and program improvements coming soon. We have also joined forces with FMI Food Safety Team and have brought the retailers to the conference as well. We have a suggested retail track for the audience. However, others can attend these sessions as well. We will offer training classes prior to the conference on Sunday, October 23rd, and Monday, October 24th. The courses require payment of an additional fee, but you can find all of this information at sqfconference.com for more information and to register. With that said, I'm now going to turn it over to Jim Zakaitis, who is the National Sales Manager at Hillbrush. Jim?
Great, I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for participating in the Hillbrush Company portion of this SQF webinar. My name is Jim Zakaitis, and I'm the North American Sales Manager for Hillbrush. Briefly, the Hillbrush Company is a 94-year-old family-owned and operated business originally founded in England and manufacturing the finest range of manual cleaning tools in the world for the food processing industry. These tools include brushes and brooms, squeegees and buckets, hanging systems and shadow boards, and much more. Our Baltimore production and distribution facility services all of North America allowing for rapid delivery of product. Today, I would like to address 3 challenges that food processors are currently facing and how our unique technologies address these issues. With that, please follow along as the PowerPoint presentation begins. 3 challenges, 3 solutions. Challenge 1 is filament loss, also known as filament retention. The way we address challenge 1 is through our resin set DRS brushware technology. The DRS means dual retention system. It is the world's most advanced and effective filament retention system. This uses high specification components, including stainless steel staples and an antimicrobial resin known as Biomaster. This successfully prevents over 99% of bacterial contamination in the tuft or filament area. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out of those filament holes. This is a comprehensive product range available in up to 10 colors, first established in 1986 and continually improved on since that time. Challenge 2 is bacterial contamination. This is right behind filament retention as far as a main concern of food safety managers. We address challenge 2 with our antimicrobial hygienic tools. This shows due diligence from the food safety team and reduces the risk of cross-contamination or contamination in general by using the antimicrobial hygienic tools. The Biomaster additive is impregnated into the brush itself as well as into the resin that we fill those holes with and the filaments. The brush back, the resin, the filaments, they all contain that silver ion Biomaster additive to prevent harboring of bacteria. And as I mentioned, it includes the resin set DRS system previously mentioned in Challenge 1. Challenge 3, foreign object contamination. We developed originally the DRS system, but we actually improved on it by making some of our product lines totally metal detectable and X-rayable. This shows due diligence and the risk of reduces the risk of contamination with these products. The brushback, the resin, the filaments, they're all fully metal detectable and X-rayable. And again, it includes the resin set DRS filament retention technology. Many customers ask us, well, that's wonderful. We have metal detectors. How do we know it works? We developed this over a number of years, and our products in this particular range were independently tested by Mettler Toledo on the SafeLine series of machines. All of that documentation is readily available to our customers. So, why choose Hillbrush? We are the only manufacturer in the world of fully color-coded hygienic cleaning tools that feature the resin set technology, the metal detection X-ray technology, and the antimicrobial technology. We control all of our own moldings, meaning our standards of quality are unparalleled within the industry. And again, pioneers of industry development, we developed the DRS in 1986. The products are made using all virgin materials, all FDA, EU, CFIA compliant, state-of-the-art injection molding facility. In fact, we just opened our new factory in England, and we have our Baltimore distribution center in Baltimore, Maryland, and we are actually looking for a new facility in Baltimore. So we easily reach over 95 countries with our products. Our affiliated partners, of course, SQF and everybody else that we work with, all FDA-approved materials, ISSA, brush manufacturers, associations, companies like that. We will be at the SQF conference in Orlando. We are very excited about that opportunity, and we very much look forward to meeting any of you there who wish to meet with us. We would also if you would like more information or complimentary sample of any of these revolutionary products, you can reach out to me at info@hillbrush.com or jim@hillbrush.com, and I will happily send you out a sample for evaluation. And that is our brief presentation for today, and I will turn the meeting over to Leanne Chuboff.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much for that presentation regarding the color-coded brushes. I actually have a story about that. I used to work for the National Restaurant Association, and we were gathering feedback about using different types of, what went wrong in the industry. Well, one example, there was E. coli in the presence of the yogurt machine, and they're all trying to figure out why there was E. coli in the yogurt machine, and it turned out that they were used, because the brushes weren't color-coded, they were using the same type of brush to clean, it looked similar brush that they were using to clean the toilets that they were using to clean the yogurt machine. So it is very important to use those color-coded brushes. So great information.
Sure.
I look forward to seeing you at the conference, so it'll be good to have you there. All right,
no, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what we're going to talk about is about FSMA and the SQF way. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. If you have specific questions on the webinar or during the webinar, feel free to chat them in. We're going to take a look at those questions at the end and then answer them all at once. So if we don't get to your question about the content in the webinar, it will be addressed at the end. If you have technical difficulties or anything like that, feel free to chat them in, and Leslie will get to that right away. But before I begin, I want to introduce myself. I'm Leanne Chuboff. I'm the Senior Technical Director here at SQF. My co-presenter is Brian Armentrout, and he is going to take all of his industry experience and share with you some of the challenges and implementation strategies for implementing FSMA and complying to the PC rule if you're with an SQF certified facility. So, so today what we're going to talk about is just go over what those basic rules and timelines of FSMA are. We want to identify those differences within the PC rule and SQF. There's about 5 questions that I get about FSMA, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. Go over the checklist that Sarah referred to, and really going over that FSMA resource page so you can get an idea of where you could go for top-of-mind information. And then Brian's going to take over and look at connecting SQF and FSMA together and those challenges to implementing FSMA. So as you know, the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law 5 years ago, so it seems like just yesterday, but really the law was signed into effect January 4th, 2011, and that gave FDA immediate authorities to do a number of things: increase inspection for suppliers, increase records access and looking at those records at the supplier level, mandatory recall authority. They're really, most of the recalls were voluntary, and I would say all but one happily complied with FDA, but now it is a mandatory recall. FDA has that authority. Import certification authority, and FDA can now charge fees for reinspection. Looking at detention administration as well when it comes to suppliers, and then, of course, registration and then suspension of that registration. So all these were signed and went into effect already. As we know, the PC for human food went into effect in just, I think, last week. So we have the Preventive Controls for human food. It went into effect a year after its published date, so that was just last week. Animal food as well for the CGMPs went into effect last week, and next year the PC rule. Produce safety goes into effect in November. Foreign supplier goes into effect next May. Accreditation of third-party auditors goes into effect next May as well. Sanitary transportation goes into effect April of 2017, and then, of course, food defense goes into effect in 2019. Now, there are some changes to these implementation timelines, If you want to know the full list of changes, I recommend you go to the SQF website, the FSMA resource page, because there's a nice table on there that kind of explains what those changes are and connects it to the date. And then there's also a link to the actual compliance change dates. But for the most part, the effects and the changes really are for the small suppliers and those implementation dates. And there's specific requirements, like in foreign supplier, it's really on food contact surfaces where that extends that date 2 years to get more comments and understanding how this rule would apply to those foreign suppliers. And then for domestic sites, for the preventive controls, as you know, I'll go into the supplier controls. There needs to be written assurances if there is a risk that's controlled by your supplier. The risk still needs to be controlled, but the written assurance part is going to be delayed. That's not going to be required for 2 years, I believe. So you can take a look at here as to where you fit, whether you're a grower, a manufacturer, or distributor, or whatever, and which rule particularly applies to you. So you can take a look to see which rules would apply to you to understand what you would need to comply. Because that's the first thing you need to understand is, where do I fit within this entire FSMA rule? Which rule applies to me? So take a look at this table and figure out where you go. So let's go on to those FAQs. Number one is, of course, what are those differences between the PC rule and SQF? So what do I need to do differently when it comes to my regular food safety plan versus what I need, how I need to comply with the regulatory requirements? Then everybody wants to know what's going on with Edition 8, and if we're going to change our code to comply with the new preventative controls, and then look at the FSMA food safety plan, and will that be accepted instead of HACCP? Also, what kind of tools does SQF have in order to support our stakeholders, and what's the role GFSI is going to play within FSMA? So let's start off with question number one, which is, what are those key differences? So the key differences that we have in the SQF and the preventative controls. So this is preventive controls for human food. So I took a look at the requirement, and then I looked at what FDA is requiring, what SQF is requiring, and what GFSI requires. So when you look at the written food safety plan, I would say this is the biggest differentiator when it comes to what FDA requires versus what SQF and GFSI requires. So SQF and GFSI has the following codex, includes a recall plan that's required. So FDA is different, as you know. They have their written food safety plan. So they don't want to call it HACCP. They don't want you to call it HERP-C. They want you to say it's a written food safety plan that includes those preventive controls for your process controls, your allergen controls, your sanitation controls, and your supply chain controls. So there needs to be specific preventive controls identified using each of those 4 buckets when you're looking at your process, which is pretty much what your HACCP plan is. So if you're looking at your HACCP plan, you're identifying your process controls, cooking, cooling, chilling, whatever that might be. Those are basically your process controls. Then you also have to look at your allergens. And with SQF, your allergen program is part of your food safety plan anyways. So you are looking at your allergens to understand, what are my preventive controls to address the risk of allergens? And you're identifying that as a preventive control. Then you look at sanitation, like environmental monitoring, and how you control those risks to your environment and identifying those preventive controls within sanitation. And then you're looking at your supply chain. And this is a little bit different because traditionally with HACCP, what we start with is what? Our ingredients coming into the facility. We need to take it back now and look at our supplier, not just the ingredient coming into the facility, but what's the risk to the supplier as well in the region, in the product that they're supplying to the facility. So we need to take a look at that and identify what those risks are to the supplier. So what FSMA is doing is stepping it back a notch and looking at those risks.
And when you think about it, and if you've participated in any of the professional updates or any of the other updates that I do with SQF, supply chain and the recalls from the supply chain source is a concern that we have to address. So what we're getting is contaminated product from our suppliers. So garbage in, garbage out. We just can't look at the ingredient and identify those risks anymore. We have to take it back and look at the supply chain. Now, if your supplier is controlling a risk for you, if I'm receiving a ready-to-eat product and I'm going to use it, if I'm making granola bars and I'm receiving nuts that have been roasted and they're controlling that risk at that supplier, that's when you have to look and see about those written assurances and how is that being controlled as it's coming into my facility. And that's what you need to look at, is what is that supplier doing in order to control those risks. So it's HACCP blown up and looking at it from, you could say, almost 4 different angles when you're looking at your process preventive controls, which you've already addressed within your HACCP plan, your allergen preventive controls, which you've probably already addressed within your HACCP plan if you're SQF, your sanitation, meaning environmental monitoring, and your supply chain. So when you look at HACCP, traditionally, HACCP focuses on the process. So we're looking at the hazards, the critical control points, your critical limits, the monitoring, and your corrective actions. And what we're looking at is the process where it looks at from corrective action, reanalyzing your critical control points. So what FSMA does is FSMA looks at, can you go back? So what FSMA does is that it looks at more than just HACCP, and you're looking at those preventive controls and not just your critical control points, but you really need to look at your preventive controls, your process, which are your CCPs, your allergens, your sanitation, and your supply chain, and identify those within your written food safety plan as it relates to FSMA and your PC rule. So, and then you're identifying your parameters and values, which means it doesn't necessarily have to be that critical limit or that monitoring point, but it can be a parameter or a value, or can be rewashed or recleaned or whatever it needs to be, visibly clean. Where HACCP is more structured and traditional, preventive controls really focuses on what those risks are in your operation and how you should address it. And again, looking at those 4 areas, your process, your allergen, sanitation, and supply chain. And then you're monitoring and implementing corrective action or corrections. So again, corrective action, as we know from SQF, is doing that root cause analysis and getting down to the root cause analysis to implement long-term preventive controls. Where correction is that immediate fix. Like I said, you could rewash a line, and that's a correction, and that's acceptable under the PC rule. So that's the main difference, is really understanding what the difference is between that written food safety plan as it relates to the PC rule versus the written food safety plan as it relates to HACCP. So I'm going to go back. And that's really the biggest difference when it comes to some of these key differences that are out there. The other difference that we see is the difference in the experienced individual in charge. And the difference is that SQF requires an SQF practitioner that has to have HACCP training, because HACCP is what is implemented within the SQF code. GFSI, there is really no requirement to have that experienced individual in charge. FDA requires you to have a PCQI, which is a Preventive Controls qualified individual. And this person has to have specific training, or they can demonstrate knowledge. So my recommendation for you is to have the specific training. So there's an alliance, FSPCA, the Food Protection, don't know what the C stands for, alliance, but they have developed training, and it's specific to PCQI training. and it's really the only approved training that's out there. So if you are signing up for a training course, be sure you are signing up for a course conducted through the Alliance, FSPCA. So make sure you're taking that course. Now, we've asked FDA, what is demonstration of knowledge? What are those requirements for demonstration of knowledge? And quite frankly, we don't have a solid answer. So my recommendation to everybody is just go through the course. Actually, the course is very informative. It goes over not just food safety, but application of the preventive controls requirements. So my recommendation is go through that course. There's a lot of them available out there, and you can certainly have your pick of instructors, and even the instructors are approved by the Alliance. So my recommendation is to do that. But the practitioner, they're responsible for implementing and maintaining SQF. They're not required to have PCQI training, but there is a designated person, and oftentimes that practitioner is the PCQI designated in the site, but they don't necessarily have to be. The other difference is that with SQF, the designated practitioner has to be per site, right? You have to have a food safety individual per site, where the PCQI, that can be a consultant. That can also be in corporate. It doesn't necessarily, there has to be one designated to that site, but it doesn't have to be per site working at that site. So that's another big difference out there. The other difference is trained staff. Well, actually, it's pretty much comparable. It's just a different terminology, where FDA, you require that PCQI and the qualified individual. That qualified individual has to understand the tasks at hand, the tasks that they're doing. Where for SQF, we do require training, food safety training for the task that individual has to have. We require written instructions. We require training for tasks like HACCP, or that employees need to understand allergens as it relates to their job, or even when it comes to sanitation or pest control. So it's really making an awareness and understanding. So there are similarities, just SQF, I think, goes into a little bit more detail. And GFSI absolutely requires employees to be trained adequately, et cetera. So little bit of differences there, but in general, everybody needs to know what they're doing as it relates to their job and as it relates to food safety and preventing any risks from occurring. The next comparable difference is validation of controls. So the difference really, I think SQF exceeds in this area, where FDA says the validation can be conducted within 90 days of production or when the process changes. Additionally, validation only has to be conducted for those the process controls. They don't have to be conducted for the other allergens, sanitation, or supply chain, where SQF really requires validation on pretty much all that you're doing, especially as it relates to HACCP and every other program that's out there or that you have in your facility. Additionally, it's to be conducted prior to that activity, and honestly, I don't know how you could do it any other way. So you have to understand what you're trying to control and the limit that you're trying to control. If you're cooking chicken, or chilling food, or storing food, or identifying room temperatures, or even where bait stations should be, you need to understand where they should be and why before you implement your process and your procedure. So validation activities are really to be conducted prior to you actually implementing the critical control point or limit or whatever. And they need to be reviewed annually, or if there's a process change or something significantly happens to your operation. So that's when they need to be revisited. And with GFSI, of course, validation activities are a part of the HACCP activity as well. Next, comparable difference that we have are those corrective actions. So again, I believe SQF exceeds in this area, where FDA corrections are allowed without the actual corrective actions. But a corrective action, if there is a preventive control violation, then there needs to be a corrective action for any of those PC violations. So there has to be a corrective action for any, process control violation that's out there. SQF, we require corrective action to be conducted for all identified nonconformances. So if you have a nonconformance in your internal audit or a nonconformance in your SQF certification audit, there needs to be a corrective action plan identified that includes a root cause analysis. So you can go back to the 5 whys, you can go back to a fishbone diagram, you can go back to any of the factors for identifying what that issue was in order to create a long-term preventative solution. GFSI, of course, addresses corrective action in that there have to be procedures for the determination and implementation of corrective action for any significant nonconformity relating to food safety. So again, very similar, where I think SQF and GFSI exceed a little bit. Record retention, comparable, similar. There's the requirement in there. For FDA, bottom line, you need to retain your records for at least 2 years. You know, you can use exception records, meaning I can use my freezer readout, and I'm not going to record once an hour what the freezer temperature is, but I will record when the freezer exceeds that particular temperature. And so FDA allows for those exception records, but however, it has to be validated, and the implementation records need to be kept as part of that food safety plan. So anything you do for that written food safety plan, that implementation, make sure you maintain those records. But record retention is for 2 years. SQF doesn't define a particular time frame. The best thing about SQF, that I think is the best thing, is that really the program is science, good science and good sense. That's what we like to say. So you're developing a plan that works for your operation, and your record retention is really based on a bunch of different factors. It could be based on shelf life. It could be based on the product that you produce. It could be based on where you're located. It could be based on a bunch of different stuff. However, we don't mandate a particular time frame. That really is based off to the facility. If you're an FDA facility or a registered facility, whether you're domestic or importing, you need to make sure you retain those records for 2 years. And again, GFSI follows what SQF does, or SQF follows what GFSI does, in the fact that it's really up to the facility. So, you know, that it's a regulatory requirement. You need to follow it. Food defense. Right now, I say TBD because we're in the midst of writing our Edition 8. So FDA requires vulnerability assessment, actionable process, steps and timeline, implementation strategies, et cetera. That is part of the PC role, where SQF is a food defenses plan is required. Will include economic adulteration as it relates to what the GFSI requirement is. So GFSI is requiring food fraud, and that's going to be in their new benchmarking requirements next year. So it's a food fraud vulnerability assessment, mitigation procedures, records, written plan, et cetera, will have to be developed in part of any of the GFSI schemes, so SQF will follow suit. FDA includes economic adulteration in there, and that is part of the PC rule. Product release, so a little bit of a difference here, just mainly in the time frame. So GFSI and SQF all require product release procedures in place before shipment. FDA requires that the monitoring and corrective action records are to be reviewed within 7 working days from the time they were created. Bottom line, if you are releasing your product within 7 working days, make sure you review those records, or after, you know, if you're not releasing your product, after 7 working days, then make sure you review those records before they get released. So again, it has the process in place. Couple other minor differences when we're looking just really at verbiage as we're using it within the SQF code and the PC rule. Rework is called out within the PC rule. So rework held in bulk includes temperature and humidity control, where SQF talks about the storage of rework, however, doesn't really look at the humidity conditions, isn't identified. However, we do call out that there has to be proper storage of all food, ingredients, food contact packaging, et cetera, and that would include rework. So again, GFSI, SQF follow the same thing. Outdoor bulk vessels, again, it's just a matter of using that terminology. SQF doesn't specifically address outdoor bulk vessels. However, FDA does, that it calls it out that precautions need to be put into place to protect the food that's in these bulk vessels, where SQF and GFSI, same things, not specifically identified. However, there needs to be storage and holding of the food. Those requirements are in place in protecting that food. And again, comparable terminology, the use of gases like modified atmosphere packaging or MAP packaging and the gases that are used. So gases mechanically introduced into food to make sure that it's treated so as not to contaminate, where it's indirect food additives. SQF and GFSI, not specifically identified. Again, food and food additives are to be safe for use in a food establishment. That's really where we go, but it's not specifically identified. So those are some of those key differences that are out there within SQF, and really the number one question that I get. So take a look at this. What will your PC plan look like, or what are you working on right now? So the other question that I get as a follow-up to this is, do I need to have 2 food safety plans for SQF? Do I need to have a PC plan for FDA that addresses that, and do I have to have a HACCP plan to address SQF? And the answer is no or yes. It really all depends on how you want to develop your plan. SQF requires HACCP. We require HACCP because that's what's benchmarked under GFSI, and that's what we need to have in order to maintain our benchmarking status. But you can alter your food safety plan, your HACCP plan, to include PCs. FDA is very open to understanding that traditionally we follow HACCP and we use CCPs. So they don't care if you call your PC a CCP. All they want you to do is make sure that you address, when you're writing your food safety plan, you're looking at it from these 4 buckets: your process PCs, your allergen PCs, your sanitation PCs, and your supply chain PCs. How you want to do that is completely up to you. I've had sites say, you know what, I've started from scratch. I looked at my HACCP plan, and then I just developed a PC plan following the recommendations that I got, or using the requirements within the PC rule, and identified it, and then merged the 2 together. Or I looked at my HACCP plan, and I looked at the 4, and I added the requirements for sanitation and supply chains because the process and allergens were already addressed. So it depends on how you want to develop your food safety plan to meet your food safety needs. You can certainly develop one plan as it relates, but the plan that you develop in order to meet SQF code requirements has to follow HACCP using Codex, meaning those 5 steps that you have when you're looking at your process and verifying your process and identifying the intended use of your product and who will be consuming your product, etc. Those 5 steps, as well as the 7 principles, that's what HACCP following Codex is. So how you develop your PC plan is completely up to you, and how you want to meet the requirements within the SQF code as well as the regulatory requirements within the PC rule. But remember PASS. If you're thinking, what were those 4 buckets again? PASS: process, allergen, sanitation, supply chain. Some of the other FAQs that I get is really, the other one is, are we going to change our code based on the new preventive controls? And all my answer is maybe, yes, no, depends, but maybe. So what we're looking at is the final rule, and we'll make those necessary changes that will affect and address food safety and based on our stakeholder feedback and comments. So as we're writing Edition 8, there are things within the PC rule that we're going to look at, and that's really as it relates to what's causing recalls, as it relates to what's causing food safety issues among our stakeholders. And there's some of those issues like perhaps we need to look at rework more closely within our code, and that's what we're doing. Perhaps we need to add gases as a requirement, and that's what we're doing. But will we change it so that you can have a PC rule instead of HACCP? Again, I go back to what are the requirements under GFSI, and what will they be doing to change that? So the question then is, will FSMA, the food safety plan, the PC food safety plan, be accepted instead of HACCP? And if GFSI, that requirements document provides us the latitude to make that differentiation, we will certainly consider that change. But right now, in order to be benchmarked to GFSI, we need to make sure that we have HACCP as a requirement. HACCP is the international language for food safety. For Europe, Australia, Asia, everybody knows HACCP, and that's what we have to look at as it relates to all of our global stakeholders. So what kind of tools does SQF have available for suppliers, CBs, and auditors? We did the comparison to the final PC rule. So Dr. Atchison did that, and that was posted on our website last year when the final rule came out. What we did in addition to that is developed a guidance document as well as a checklist that is now available on our FSMA resource page. And Sarah talked about that, and I'm going to give you another shot at understanding what is on that FSMA resource page. Really, it is a great tool and a great source for our stakeholders to go to understand what's happening out there as it relates to the PC rule. I also want to talk to you about going to FMI. They've had some number of excellent webinars out there as it relates to understanding each of these 7 rules. So going and taking all those regulatory requirements, all the regs that came out, FMI does a great job. Hillary and Stephanie Barnes, who's part of our GR staff, and Hillary Fesmar, who's our Vice President of Food Safety, they do a great job of dissecting and simplifying those rules so that you can understand how they would apply to you. So I would recommend going to the FMI website as well. And then what is the role that GFSI will play within FSMA? Primarily, I would have to say it's going to be part of a foreign food facilities, mainly like through foreign supplier verification program. So again, look at the resources that are out there available. Seek assistance from those trade associations. I'm telling you, FMI is a wonderful resource. There's other resources like AFI, other resources, even, the produce associations where we do a lot of partnership with. So look to those trade associations. They're a wonderful resource. So here's the link to the FSMA resource page on our website, so suppliers-FSMA-resource-page. So look on there. And then again, FDA is another good resource. They actually have the Technical Assistance Network, or TAN, where you can just chat in a question, whether it's an implementation, a code or PC interpretation, or even a technical interpretation. So you can go to many of these resources, which are very helpful, and these are the ones that I use. So here's the FSMA resource page. Look at what's available on this web page. Honestly, just go to SQFI.com, go to the center right there, and it says, "Are you FSMA ready?" Click on that. You can find click to the checklist, click to our guidance, download our guidance. Look at the number of FAQs that we get as it relates to FSMA, the resources that we have to our training centers who can do PCQI training, so that's listed on there, as well as FDA links and the latest news. Like I said, if you want to know what are those changes to the compliance dates, go to this resource page. It's right there on our resource page. So here's the PC rule checklist. This is what we put together. It's a printable checklist that you can either print off or use on your computer. But the checklist is to be used as a readiness tool for compliance. Meeting the requirements in this checklist doesn't automatically give you compliance to the PC rule, all right? We have not reached an agreement with FDA to say that we can act as agents on behalf of FDA, so really it's there to be used as a readiness tool for compliance. The guidance that's available provides clarity to those differences, and it also gives you links to those resources. So the guidance is to be used in conjunction with this PC rule checklist, so it gives you an opportunity to provide a little bit more what those differences are. And the checklist is also going to be available on the SQF assessment database, so your certification body can conduct this compliance activity on your behalf if you wanted a third eye to do that. So talk to your CV. They can also do this for you. So some of the features when we design this checklist It's easy access on the SQFI.com resource, FSMA resource page. It can be printable or computer friendly. Many of these response boxes are drop-down fields, so you can use them and either on your computer or really just print it out and you can write it out. It references the PC rule and the SQF code requirements. So there's the dual reference there that kind of links it up. And then it also includes a summary of requirements a summary of the requirements of those additional requirements and the differences that are in there. Additionally, we included a box for the primary response, so you're either in compliance or out of compliance, a spot for typing in evidence as to why whether you're in compliance or out of compliance and why. And then if you're out of compliance, gives you an opportunity to implement your corrective action and what you're going to do to ramp yourself up. So go to the SQF website and the FSMA resource page, because that's exactly where this is, and it's going to be a great tool to give you to understand where you're ready within compliance to the PC rule. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brian Armentrout. Brian, just to give you a brief bio on Brian and why we selected him to give you the supplier side of this. So Brian has over 20 years of industry experience in food safety, quality, and ramping up these programs for these facilities, especially as it relates to SQF. So as the PC rule was coming out, Brian, of course, was heavily involved in understanding what the rule is and how it would affect his facility. So what Brian has done now is actually gone out on his own so that he can provide his consulting and his guidance on how suppliers can prepare not just to meet the PC rule or to meet SQF, but really to take his expertise and assist those food companies in how to deploy effective food safety and quality systems. So again, it's not just about meeting a regulatory requirement, that's the law, you have to do that, or SQF, but it's using the two to implement and make a better food safety and quality system. So Brian's going to use all of his expertise, and he's going to share his knowledge with you today. So welcome, Brian, and thank you very much for participating on the webinar.
Great. Thanks, Leanne. I appreciate that. And I hope everybody on the line here appreciates having the opportunity to listen to Leanne talking about SQF and all these programs, because she's really the expert in this area, and so very grateful for this insight from Leanne. Thank you. So today, really what I wanted to talk about is the nuts and bolts piece of this and implementation of this, and this is what my company has been out doing, is in the field, is putting these type of programs in place. So going out, getting your PCQI certification, looking at your existing GFSI programs, your SQF systems, and then saying, how can I use this to meet the requirements? And really, this is a golden opportunity for everybody, because this is a chance to really go back and look at your systems at a 30,000-foot level and say, is this really appropriate for what we need to be doing in our company? And because of the emphasis that FDA and the government has put on this, it's a really good opportunity to raise this level of expectations within your company. One of the things that I've been working with companies and making them aware of is things within the law, such as the park doctrine that FDA is using, and making sure that companies at a senior level really are using their food safety and food quality systems to manage these activities, and that's going to become more and more important. So really want to kind of go over today is a couple of things. Go a little bit about my company, what we've been doing, then really dive into a FSMA overview, and I'm not going to get too far into this because most of the people know what's going on now. Really want to get into is when you're setting up a food quality system, a food safety system, how do you do with FSMA in mind? And really what you want to do here is create one system. We all have enough to do. We don't need multiple systems that we're trying to manage across multiple platforms to keep multiple people happy. So the best way to think of this within your systems is, how do I educate? Because one of the main lessons that everybody really needs to emphasize, and as we get into the presentation, I talked about this at several points, is you're an open book now. If you are an FDA facility that wasn't previously under, let's say, LACF or things of this activity, a lot of the different things that you had it was at your discretion to share that information with FDA relative to your HACCP plans or other programs and other things not necessarily involved with interstate commerce. FDA has an open book to this now. And the good part of this whole process is they're going through the same training that everybody in industry is going through, so we're all looking at this from the same page. And as we went through and FDA was writing the regulations, that was something that they really worked very hard on. So I think FDA has done a really good job with that. And with the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliances and the different activities out there, I think we've got a good footing for this. So let's dive into this stuff. So really with the Food Leadership Group and what we've been focusing on is the step that's before the audit and the certification. So you have a standard under GFSI such as SQF. You have certification bodies such as Silica or other companies that come in and perform the audits, but those people can't consult. Our company is focused on getting you ready for those activities. So that can be FSMA, it can be SQF, it can be other programs. So we're the group that's in the front piece getting you ready for those type of activities. So this for me kind of boils down to what I refer to as 4 rules of the game. Know your standard. And one of the things I've always worked with, and I've worked, as Leanne said, I've worked in the industry for over 20 years. I put together the food quality programs at multi-billion-dollar companies. And you have to understand your standard. Regardless of what that standard is, you have to understand that standard better than the person who's coming into your facility to audit. That could be the CFR, it can be GFSI, it doesn't matter. You have to understand that standard and how that relates to your facility. You then need to arrange those documents in a hierarchy. And I'll get into this a little bit more here in the presentation of what I'm talking about here. But you have to be able to walk that person through what's the standard, why are you doing it, how do you document it, and what's the proof that you got that done. If you can do that in the downward direction, it's great, but it also works in the other direction as well because you're also able then to identify things within your system that you don't necessarily need. I refer to this as simpler is harder. It's very easy for quality systems over time to become very convoluted and very complex. People come and go within companies. Different people write different documents depending upon different crises or things that happen at different points in time, and those things just tend to hang around. Keep in mind now that FDA can look at those things if they're part of your food safety plan. Do you want FDA seeing those things, and are they clear? It's a perfect chance to arrange that information. Know what's in scope. Remove the rest of the stuff. Do you really need those type of programs? And we'll get into that a little bit more as well. So basically what you're showing an auditor or regulator or someone coming into your facility is requirement and compliance. And in a lot of ways with the Food Safety Modernization Act, we're going back to basics. I've heard the new programs described as taking HACCP back in time, really. So preventive controls essentially are how CCPs were controlled originally, which was everything became a critical control point. So preventive controls and your prerequisite programs are a step back in that direction. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this. And it all comes back to plan, do, check, act, right? The basic blocking and tackling of what a good quality systems needs within a facility. So a couple of points that kind of stuck with me when FSMA came out was Margaret Hamburg said at the time that we're really going to focus on that risk-based inspection of food processing facilities. And Levitt, who was with CIPSAN, who's over at Hogan and Lovells now, said the dynamic has changed. And one of the key factors that needs to be recognized is FDA really looks at how this is done legally from a lawyer's viewpoint. Are you compliant or not? So you have to make that as clear as possible. So your responsibilities under this program, of course, the number one thing is going to be your food safety plan and how you relate that to your preventive controls. Supply chain management. So the dates have been pushed back, right? So foreign supplier verifications now May of 17. Okay, not that bad. We got a little more time, but that's 8 months. That's 8 months away. And what's interesting about your supplier verification piece of it is the larger your company is, it just means the bigger that problem becomes. At Dean Foods, we had thousands of suppliers. How do you possibly go through and audit all those people? You can't. So you have to have a program in place that identifies risk. Records maintenance and access is going to be huge. You need to really spend a lot of time looking at your records and anything that's within your food safety plan, how is that being presented and how are you closing the loop on those activities? Food defense and intentional adulteration. This is coming down the road. But this, of course, was a big concern with FDA relative to melamine and other activities that have been going out there. And there's a lot of good resources that are working on the intentional adulteration piece. But your food defense biosecurity information still needs to be there as well. So don't forget about that as you move forward. So for some, what is voluntary is now mandatory. Well, what am I saying there? So if you were under LACF or other programs where FDA had access under JUICE or things like this, FDA could already see a lot of this stuff. If you weren't, this is all new. So everything that's underneath your food safety plan relative to your analysis, your monitoring, your preventive controls, your prerequisites, your verification activities, all of this type of stuff is now accessible to FDA. And under the law as well, they have the right to take all that information with them. So one of the questions I get over time is what's going to happen with that information? It's my, and this is strictly my opinion on this, what's going to happen over time is FDA is going to use this to develop out standardized templates and information relative to risk assessment for particular industries. So if they're going into a mozzarella manufacturing facility over time, and we're talking 5 to 10 years out, they're going to have a pretty good idea of what it is that they expect within that facility relative to your food safety plan. So if you have things that deviate from that, you have unique situations, those things really need to be looked at very closely. So looking at your documents in a hierarchy. This is the way I always like to think about this, is relative to your systems. At the top of the pyramid is your standard, whatever it is that you're using to create your quality system. So in this case, it's a combination Food Safety Modernization Act and SQF. Now what's nice about SQF, level 2 corresponds very nicely to food safety plans. Level 3 is your food quality plans. And I'll use an example here later of how I'm breaking this out, and it's a good way of looking at your systems to figure out how do you present this information to FDA. Your quality manual, and I take a different approach on this than most people do. I view your quality manual not as the collection of documents that you put in a binder and you put on a shelf. Your quality manual is really the bridge between the standard and what you do within your facility or within your company. It's the explanation point. I'll show you an example of that here a little bit later. Policies are simply stakes in the ground. These are things that reference back to requirements and state a position relative to how your company handles those things. So organic certification or kosher, things like this. They don't tell you how to do anything. They tell you what your relative position is within the industry in that area. Your procedure is a document that addresses how to do something that impacts multiple people within a facility. So an easy way to think of this is your different managers within different areas. If they have to have agreement relative to a procedure, then that's how that's handled. So how GMPs are implemented, right? So it's agreement between the quality manager and the operations manager and other people within that facility of how you're going to do that. A work instruction, by contrast, is somebody performing a task. What are those things? What are they measuring? How do they measure it? What do they do about it if those things fail? And what's nice about that is that definitely folds directly into your food safety plan and how you're controlling those activities underneath, as Leanne talked about, PAS, right? Process, allergen, sanitation, and supply chain. So how are you controlling your process relative to your preventive controls? And then your recording forms are the proof that you did those things. So just as I talked through this down from the top, you also can bring this from the bottom up. You could look at a recording form. How does that link in within your system? If it's not relevant to your food safety plan or your quality systems, do you really need to be doing that? So here's an example relative to SQF, and the one I pulled out here was complaint management, because I think this is a pretty good one. Because complaints break into two categories, food safety and food quality. A food safety complaint would be, I ate your product, I'm allergic to peanuts, and I had a reaction, and there's no peanuts on the label, I think you've got a problem, right? Pretty serious issue that needs immediate investigation. A food quality issue would be, I bought a bag of your product and the seal was damaged, or the weight was too low, or I didn't like how it tasted. Food quality. Key distinction here within your food safety plan. FDA has full right to view all of your complaints relative to food safety. Food quality, this references back to the pyramid, is out of scope. FDA doesn't need to see that information. So when you're designing your systems, you should be putting that together so you're painting a picture and showing FDA that process, because the question will be from FDA when they're plant is, show me your complaints. If you show them everything, there's no point to that. You need to show them your food safety related complaints. So in the example here, I've got pulled out of the standard what SQF is saying relative to complaint management and the things that they're looking for within their system. The section below in italics is how that's met at a particular company. It's an explanation of how that's done. So we have systems in place for gathering complaints. There's a process that we do for determining if it's food safety and food quality, and we have all the different types of follow-up things, right? So if you visualize that pyramid, here's the standard, here's the quality manual, this references the procedure, and then that will come later that we can show the auditor that. So the example here that I have is a simple document matrix that was thrown together in Word. This can be done in any type of program. But regardless as if you're using an automated system that does this for you or you're doing it manually, the principles still all remain the same. You need to understand how these things all link together and what's relevant or what's not. So in this particular example, 215, complaint management, I have a procedure in this example, so procedure QA corporate number 1. There's 2 different recording forms that we use for filling out this information. So as we're showing this to the auditor, we can say, relative to the standard, I can now show you what it is that you're looking for. The advantage to this as well is it keeps the audit on track. So this works for SQF audits. It also works for FSMA audits as well. So the question comes up from the auditor or the regulator. How do you handle complaints? So in this example under 215, you would then walk them through this process. Here's the standard and here's what it says. Here's our quality manual and here's what it says in relation to the standard. Here's our document matrix that lists out the relevant documents that we have that allow us to control this process. Here's the actual procedure of how we do this, and you walk the auditors through that, and it lists out roles and responsibilities and all that type of good stuff. And then here's the recording form where we actually list out complaints. So let's go over and look at some of those records so we can show you how this process works. And then, of course, this cross-links to other programs like corrective action and things of this nature. So you're walking the auditor through this virtual pyramid from a high level to a granularity where they can see that you're actually meeting compliance. So one of the biggest things that I see with FSMA that's going to be a large challenge, and I referenced this earlier, was supply chain. It's a unique problem in that as your company gets larger, the problem grows, logarithmically. It just gets enormous. But as a smaller company, you also have issues as well because you're dealing with brokers and other small orders, and you may not necessarily have that visibility into your supply chain. So brokers, which are directly called out within the law, need to understand this as well. And there's requirements within SQF, and there was a lot of questions at a recent information day relative to brokers' role within the Food Safety Modernization Act. So definitely if you're using that type of activity, check that out. So you need to have a plan in place for compliance with food safety. FDA is really going to be focused on an allergen control. Those records are completely available to FDA to review. You need to focus your resources in justifying your food safety plan. Keeping in mind that one of the interesting things with supply chain management is it's not necessarily a facility-specific activity. If you're a company of any size, a lot of these things happen at corporate. So you have the procurement team, you have R&D, you have QA, and other individuals at corporate who are looking at the supply chain. FDA is going to be at the plant. FDA is going to be asking those questions of the quality manager who may not necessarily have visibility into that system. So you have 2 different types of things that you need to do. Is you either need to make sure that your quality managers at the production facilities understand that system and can speak to it, or you need to have accessibility at your corporate personnel who then can speak to that as well. One of the things that I foresee in the future happening with this is FDA is going to start going to corporate headquarters to start asking these questions directly. So FDA is going to want to sit down with procurement and other individuals to see directly how supply chain management works. Supply chain and all the different activities around this was one of the reasons the Food Safety Modernization Act came to be, and FDA has a lot of interest in this. So as you're looking at your systems, make sure that you're developing this in a way that is easily transferable from an information standpoint for FDA or regulators or your standard so that you can explain this, and having those people available to explain that. Now, as I'd referenced earlier as well, you also have to look at this from a risk standpoint. And you can't audit everything within your supply chain database. So what are the risks? What's the document matrix you're using relative to determining risk so that you can then focus your resource on those high-risk items? And then for those ones that you're not going to be auditing on a periodic basis, what's your justification for that? So FDA is going to want to see that. FDA is also going to be exposed for the first time relative to commodities. How do commodity supply chains work? So things like cocoa and palm oil and sugar and things of this nature that trade around the world, it's not a linear supply chain. So you need to look at that and figure out how you're going to address those things. So as different risks pop up, you need to look at those as well. Listeria in sunflower seeds, who would have thought? Spices, lots of activity around spices. It's a very convoluted supply chain, and companies like McCormick have done a great job out there of figuring out how to manage that. Different areas of concern. There's a lot of concern around China, but the bottom line is you have to deal with China. Most food-grade chemicals come from China. How are you going to address that in your systems, and how are you going to explain that to FDA? That's where the risk versus location becomes more important. So, food defense and intentional adulteration. My advice on this piece is don't wait, right? Start thinking about this now. So there's a very good tool, and I put a link within a document I've got at the end of this presentation for everybody. But your food defense and your intentional adulteration, you can work these two things together. And there's going to be some good webinars coming up relative to intentional adulteration, how you deal with those things, because you need to be much more in front of those activities of what's going on in the marketplace. And the standards relative from a legal standpoint have been reduced as well. So a reasonably foreseeable standard is not necessarily the requirement anymore. The legal bar has been lowered relative to a regulator within your facility of what they can do when they determine risk. And the actions that they can take are much more stringent than they could be in the past. Bottom line, if they take away your facility registration number, you're shut down. So keep that in mind. So FSMA is your link to your quality system. So know your standard. Once again, this is the 4 rules. And so I'm reemphasizing again because these are important, right? Know your standard. Read the law. Definitely attend training. Go get, as Leanne talked about, Preventive Control Qualified Individual Training. I went through training at the IFT convention recently. It's a good course. It's 2.5 days. It's definitely worth your time. And it really goes into how to put together your programs and delineate HACCP versus food safety plan. Now, it's my position that these things can be created together, and you can create a food safety plan that meets the requirements that Leanne was talking about to make sure that you're kosher underneath all the codex requirements and all these type of things. Trade groups, GMA, we talked a little bit about FMI as well, IDFA, tons of great resources out there. Regulatory comment periods, as these new type of things come up over time, always make sure to get involved in that process. Now, these things are all closed now relative to this, but people forget to get involved in the comment periods for regulatory activities. Third parties, don't be afraid to ask for help out there. There's plenty of people out there who can help you get ready for these type of activities. Get your documents set up in a hierarchy. So at this point, you guys should have a pretty good idea what I'm talking about relative to that. What's in scope? Look at reducing your systems. My experience has been once you go in and do a quality system revision, you can generally get rid of about 50 to 60% of the documentation within your system because it's no longer relevant to managing it properly. Then show that auditor requirements and compliance relative to that standard. So walk them through that, use Plan, Do, Check, Act, and show that inspector your system and how you meet the regulations, right? So it's a conversation relative to that hierarchy. And FDA is not expecting everybody to be perfect. They understand that things are going to happen and corrective actions need to be written. And under the preventive control section, if you have a failure within the area, you have to have a corrective action relative to that. Your prerequisite programs, it's optional. Now under SQF, it's mandatory. But for the preventive controls, you have to have corrective actions relative to that. The other piece out there is the company size. Right? This is a good example of regulations versus real world. So FDA wrote provisions to give smaller companies more time to get ready. But if I'm a small company and I'm supplying to Walmart or Starbucks or whoever, they're not going to wait. They're expecting you to be compliant now. And they're already asking these questions relative to your food safety plan. So it behooves you to move quickly on this type of activity. Plus, it gives you a leg up on your competition if you already have your food safety plans in place, even though you don't need them yet. Your customers are going to look very favorably upon that. So, some closing remarks here. Where will FDA focus? bottom line here on this piece is FDA is going to focus in on high-risk areas. Right? So if you're making something that FDA knows has had recent issues, you can expect them to come into your facility. Keep up to date on changes. Attend webinars like this. Figure out what's the latest learnings relative to FSMA. This is all a brand new process, and there's lots of areas where people aren't sure how this is going to go. Keep up to date on that. Don't be the example. FDA in the beginning, and this is a pessimistic view, but if you're in an area that's a high risk and you're not doing your due diligence and something happens, you run the risk of being made an example of. Blue Bell and Chipotle are going through a lot of pain right now with the Department of Justice investigating them for potential action. Not a place you want to be. Ask for help. There's plenty of resources out there who can help you put this stuff together and are putting together food safety plans right now. So there are people who have already got this done. So as Leanne said, we'll hold off here on questions. We'll have a section for this toward the end. Do have some bonus material for everybody, so I wanted to include this in. If you text 44222 and you put in the subject line FSMA tool, FSMA tool all together, it'll fire you back a response. Put in your email, and I will send you the template that I'm actually using right now to create food safety plans. So you can use this to start putting together and start playing around with putting together a food safety plan. In addition, at the end of that, I've also put in some really valuable resources that I've used relative to justification on food safety plans. I recently did an interview with Dr. Robert Brackett. For people who don't know, he's at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and he's one of the key architects who helped put together the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance and the actual PCQI training. They control all that activity. Dr. Brackett was previously at CIFSAN after Joe Levitt. It's about a 15-minute interview, lots of good information in there, and it really goes through kind of the history of how these type of things occurred, because it's kind of a mystery of how these type of things happen sometimes. So definitely I encourage you taking a look at that. That's available on my website as well as my YouTube channel. My contact information is here, and I've also included a slide with some hyperlinks relative to websites, LinkedIn, all that type of good information that you can follow up on as well.
Alrighty, so thank you very much, Brian. Thanks for all of the information that you shared regarding SQF and FSMA and how to implement. So in conclusion, really, I mean, we're looking at to see what are your to-do lists, what's your PC-ready to-do list. And bottom line, like Brian said, become familiar with what parts of FSMA apply to your facility and understand the rule. You got to read the rule to figure out exactly what applies to your facility. Attend the PCQI training. We had some questions chat in regarding PCQI training. And with the PCQI training, it does provide a lot of good information as to how the rule would apply to your facility. We had people say, do you have a template regarding any of the preventive controls plans? Well, the training makes you go through an actual, you're going through a whole developing your PC plan based off of fictitious facilities, but it gives you an idea of what you need to do in order to identify that. And then you'll see the similarities that you have with HACCP as it relates to the PC rule. So while the PCQI training is not mandatory, so that was a question that came in, it's not mandatory. You can demonstrate to the regulatory, they're called investigators, regulatory investigators, that you are complying through education and training. However, it's not clearly defined what is education and training, how many years or what you need to know. So that's why we advise go to that PCQI training that's there. Use the checklist that we've developed to kind of just see where your facility complies. I mean, if you have an SQF certification and you look at the PC checklist that we developed, you can kind of get an idea as to, what are those differences and how ready are you for compliance. And then again, go to that FSMA resource page. Somebody chatted in that we don't have anything on sanitary transportation, but we'll get on that. So thanks for that feedback, Billy. We appreciate it. We'll put that on there. but we don't have, the only gap analysis that we have completed right now is to the PC for human food. So right now that's all we have and are focused on, but we're going to get more information as it relates to foreign supplier, as it relates to food, to produce, as well as sanitary transportation. So we'll get that. And then also go to seek network, or, network with your peers. Sarah mentioned the SQF conference in Orlando. I hope to see you guys there, but this is your opportunity to network. Go join those associations. Use the resources and the tools that you have in place, because I'm sure your facility already belongs to an association. So really, the SQF conference, we will have a session on every one of those 7 rules as it relates to FSMA implementation. So we will have a session on that when we made sure of that. We also have pre-conference training, and one of that is the PCQI training. So go to our website, look at registering for our pre-conference training, or even the SQF conference itself. We already have over, almost 600 people that are registered. So right then and there, you have 600 networking opportunities and people that you can go to. So check out our conference. It's not a technical-based conference, meaning you're not going to get the specific, technical sessions, poster sessions or whatever, but what you're going to get is practical implementation solutions for creating and continuously improving your food safety program. So check out that conference website, sqfconference.com, and look at the agenda that we have on there. So in summary, and then we'll take your questions, FSMA, SQF, GFSI, we have one thing in common, and that's really prevention. We want to take that preventive approach rather than that reaction. So at FSMA, my advice to you is don't fight FSMA, embrace it. Look at what FSMA has to offer, because what they have done is really looked at those risks, those areas that are causing foodborne illness, that are causing outbreaks, that are causing recalls under allergens, with regards to the supply chain, with regards to sanitation and environmental monitoring, and really having you evaluate that as part of your risks. So whether you want to look at HACCP or whether you want to look at your PC, your written PC plan, whatever you want to call it, look at the risks that affect your supply, what your product that you make in your facility. So take a look at that and look at it from your process controls, your allergens, your sanitation, and your supply chain. So SQF prepares you to meet current and new legislation. Why? You already know what validation is in that process because you've been through it. You know corrective action. You know the lingo. You walk the walk, you talk the talk. And that's what SQF prepares you. Yes, there are some differences, but there's differences that you can't overcome because you already have an SQF system in place. So there are some differences, but you understand what those differences and can understand how you need to improve your food safety program to address the regulatory requirements. So it's not full compliance simply because there are differences. SQF is a global program, and we have to address the needs of all of our stakeholders globally, and even here in the United States. So HACCP is a requirement for some folks under USDA, juice HACCP, seafood HACCP. So we can't forget about even within the United States, that the different regulatory requirements we have. And again, bottom line, use the resources that are available to help you through this process. You're not in it alone. Your questions aren't dumb because you ask solid questions that are going to challenge everybody to create a better food safety system. That's what we're all in it for. FDA, GFSI, SQF is to create a safer supply chain. So that's what, that's the FSMA and SQF webinar that we have today. I'm going to ask Brian to make sure he doesn't mute himself, because I do have a couple questions for him regarding implementation. So I'll go through some of the questions. We are going to try and stop at 1:30, so that, but we'll try and get all the questions that we have. I've tried to group them together. So the first question is regarding allergens for pet food facilities. So right now it is not in the PC rule. So for feed for pets. So it's not in the PC rule or feed for animals, I'm sorry. So it's not in the PC rule. The question, I think, was, do we think it's going to be in the PC rule? And I'm not here to decide whether that's going to be in there or not. Right now, it is not a requirement within the PC rule. The other question came in regarding separate food safety plans. Do I need to have a separate food safety plan for HACCP and a separate food safety plan for my PC rule? And the answer is no, you don't, or you can. Really, again, we're flexible in the way that you want to develop your written food safety plan. The way that I see it, what FSMA has outlined really mimics HACCP. It identifies those threats to your operation, has you implement critical control points, in a sense, looking at your monitoring as well as your, your validation procedures, et cetera. There are little differences. So as long as you're following HACCP for codex, your validation and verification activities for any of those CCPs that you've identified, you can certainly use one food safety plan. Like I said, I've had some folks that looked at their HACCP plan and converted it into their PC written food safety plan. I've had some folks say, I'm going to start from the ground up and I'm going to have a separate PC approach, and then I'm going to implement it and integrate it into my HACCP plan, or I'll have two plans. But really, the decision is up to you. The requirement isn't to have two food safety plans. We don't want to make you have to have two food safety plans that are out there. Then the other is regarding the requirements for training and the PCQI and the qualified individual, and whether there would be, if there's any written requirement within the PC rule, and I guess I'll divert that to Brian. I don't know if you're familiar, if there's any written requirement within the PC rule that regarding qualified individual training, and if there's anything that needs to be conducted for that.
Can you hear me, Leanne?
I'm sorry, you didn't hear me? No, I can't hear Brian. So I'll take that one. Okay, now I can hear you. Yes. So I guess is there a clarification? You can kind of describe the differences between PCQI and QI, and what are the training requirements for each of those?
Right. Yeah. So under FSMA, right, you have two options. You can go through the approved curricula and get your certification in PCQI and become a PCQI qualified individual. And at the training, you take a test, and they give you a certificate, and you put it up on the wall. And that is acceptable to FDA. The other option then is demonstrating qualifications that FDA will accept, and that's very nebulous. And it hasn't really been defined. The recommendation has been, and this is my strong recommendation as well, is go through the PCQI training. Because, once again, being pessimistic, let's say that you have an issue within your facility and you're going through a recall or something of that nature. Your credentials could come under for some pretty heavy scrutiny at that point in time. So the safer route is to get the training.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, there's, and then you can take that understanding and then trickle it down to your individuals and your qualified individuals. Couple questions and clarifications came in regarding the SQF practitioner and the relationship to the to HACCP training as well as PCQI training. So the question came in that says, so if I'm an SQF practitioner and I take PCQI training, do I still need to take HACCP training? And the answer is not necessarily. So if you, because you still have to implement HACCP following SQF or following Codex, because that's within the code, you still have to have an understanding of what HACCP is. So we're not saying that it would be one for the other, but we are saying that you can utilize the PCQI training to demonstrate your HACCP training, as long as the auditor on site can look and evaluate you, and you can demonstrate through your knowledge on site your knowledge of HACCP. So really, it's like a two-step process. One, PCQI training, plus you can take, plus you have to demonstrate your knowledge of HACCP on site during the audit to the auditor. So that's how we're looking at it. So it's not like we're saying you can't do it. We're saying that you can, as long as you demonstrate that knowledge. Then there was another question about refresher training for SQF practitioners for HACCP, and that's not part of the SQF code or the requirement of the SQF practitioner. So Brian, the other question that I have is one on record requirements. One, if you can explain the record requirements. There were some questions regarding the 2-year rule versus a 3-year requirement. Somebody had told a supplier that it's 3 years, not 2 years. And the other question that I have for you is perhaps can you go into a little bit different, what the differences are for the PC, the preventive controls or the process controls parameters versus a control point from HACCP? What are the differences and the similarities for that? If you can go over that. First the records and then process controls, those parameters that are identified versus, or are they the same as the control points in a HACCP plan?
Okay, yeah, so for the records piece, you have 2 years. So if you have something in your food safety plan, you need to maintain those records for at least 2 years. Now, part of this, though, too, is you have other rules in place as well that you need to be aware of, too. There's requirements for HR relative to training around OSHA and things like this, and you also have record retention rules relative to, let's say, organic documentation that are longer than that. So you need to look at all those different type of things and make sure that you're hitting the minimum on those type of activities. And those records also need to be available on site. So if FDA is at your production facility and they're asking about your supplier qualification program and they want to look at records for how a supplier was approved, you have to be able to get that to them within 24 hours. So how are you going to manage that if those records are at corporate? And just having a record doesn't necessarily mean it's explainable. So you also have to have somebody there who can deal with that too. The second part of the question then is, so under FSMA, really your preventive controls and how you're managing that is analogous to your critical control points, right? And how you're managing those with your corrective actions and all those type of activities. And my recommendation in that piece is not to duplicate that type of activities. I'm not labeling within the programs I'm developing things as CCPs any longer. They're being programs that are controlled under preventive controls. So this references back to kind of what I was talking about earlier in the presentation relative to how HACCP used to be managed. So we used to have within our HACCP programs all kinds of stuff, right? We had control points and critical control points and all kinds of other things that required lots of management maintenance. And then over time, those systems began to be streamlined and whittled down. So you had some critical control points, and then all the preventive, all of your prerequisite programs that you'd use to manage those. So my quick answer on that then is a good way to look at this, Leanne, is we're going back in time and you're expanding those type of activities and controlling those relative to those two main buckets under FSMA, preventive controls and prerequisite programs. And that's the best way that I've seen so far to look at that.
Thanks. And then what if a supplier, what would be your recommendation if right now a supplier doesn't have any CCPs identified? So just start from scratch, like you said, like just start with your PC or developing your written food safety plan, right?
Right, yeah, and so, yeah, if a supplier, and if you're buying a raw material from a supplier and you ask for this type of information so you can do your risk assessment and they come back and say that they don't have CCPs or controls within that would require a food safety plan, that's valid, that can be, but you have to make that decision. That's one of the things that's been coming back. I speak to companies overseas as well. They're looking at bringing products into the U.S. and what they need to do. They don't really need to do anything. You need to do something as the purchaser, right? You need to determine the risk relative to those programs and show that in writing to FDA of how you came to that conclusion, which is why the whole supplier piece of this is going to be a lot of work.
Yeah, there is a lot of questions regarding the supplier, and there are some suppliers that are having to go back to suppliers. They're being required to go back, really trace back to two. So, my example is if you are a granola bar maker and you're processing and you're using nuts that have been roasted and they're coming into the facility, your risk really to your product is 3, right, with a nut. You're looking at biological through salmonella, you're looking at foreign objects through the shell itself, and then you're looking at chemical when you're looking at the grower and the pesticide use on that. So then how far back do you go in your supply chain to understand how those risks are being addressed? Is it to all going back to the 3 all the way to the grower, or are you looking from the grower? So you're looking at the sheller is looking at the grower's requirements, the roaster is looking for the sheller, and then it goes into your granola bar facility. So there are some questions regarding how the supply chain looks, but really, mainly what you're looking at is how are those risks being addressed? At which stage are they being addressed?
Right. And this really, Leanne, gets back to a pragmatic question for the company, which is you have limited resources, right? You have only so many people that can audit and so many procurement people that can evaluate things. You need to become very efficient at figuring out what are those high-risk items within your production facility. So, for example, if you're doing that granola product and you're currently buying raw nuts, you better stop that right now, right? Because now you're getting into the written assurance piece of the Food Safety Modernization Act that says you need to control that hazard, and that's why part of that rule, why that's been pushed off so far, because that's a huge thing to tackle, right? So if FDA comes in and you're making a granola product and you're using raw nuts within that product, you're going to have a lot of justification on probably finished product testing and all kinds of stuff that FDA is going to want to see. Do you really want to do that? Probably not.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So I'd go back and look at your system, right? And that kind of gets back to those closing points I was making as well, right, is what are those hot buttons that FDA is looking at? If there's a particular problem out there that's going on that really has FDA's attention, you better make sure that you've got that button up.
Right. So there was one more question. Well, there's a bunch of other questions that I don't think we'll get to, but can you explain the documents, the hierarchy in documents? Can you better explain that? There was a question about that. What did you mean by that?
It's really looking at, so part of what I've seen in the 20 years or so I've been putting together quality systems is quality systems are put together in a vacuum. They're put together to address a particular issue at a particular point in time and to manage a particular process, but they're not looked at from the standpoint of integration within an overall system, right? What is the purpose for doing that? How does it meet the standard? And how do you show that you actually did that? If you're not meeting those criteria, why are you doing it? And it's a complicated subject. And if that individual, my email's in the presentation as well as my phone number. If you'd like some additional follow-up information, happy to talk offline on that.
Yeah, Brian's email is posted on the screen right now, so feel free to email Brian if you want to get further clarification on that. There are a bunch of other questions that came in. And I'll end on this, the other question was, when is edition 8 coming out? So that seems to be a pretty hot topic right now, yeah. So, and what's the delay? So a couple things, edition 8, for the SQF users out there, we are working on developing the changes to edition 8. There will be a public consultation period, so we will publish the changes to the SQF website mid-November. So shooting for November 15th is when we'll publish the documents for 30 days, and that will give everybody an opportunity to review the documents and provide their comment back to us. The expectation then is that we will have the code to the website released by the end of the year, so December 31st, with a 6-month implementation timeline, meaning the code will not be implemented any sooner than June 1st. So if your recertification audit is in May or any time before that, you'll be good to go with edition 7.2. After June is when edition 8 will be more than likely implemented. And why I'm not definite on these terms is because we're still waiting for the GFSI requirements document to come out. and that has not been published yet. And what we want to do is wait for those requirements to come out before we publish a code, because we don't want to publish edition 8 and then 3 months, 4 months later publish an edition 8.1. So we are looking and waiting for GFSI. The expectation is that document will come out November, December, by the end of the year, and that's where our assumptions are. So once GFSI publishes that document, then we'll have a better understanding as to when our code will be released and then implemented. But keep in mind that it will not be any sooner than June. All right, regardless of when, if GFSI publishes the document tomorrow, we will not post our code until the end of the year, and always will there be at least a 6-month implementation timeline. So again, the edition 8 public comments will be posted by mid-November. Implementation or the release of the code is expected to be at the end of the year, December 31st, and there will be a 6-month implementation timeline, and that means that the code will not have to be implemented until June. So audits prior to June will be audited under edition 7.2. So that's the what's going on with edition 8. And we will post the code as well as a summary of the code changes in mid-November. So look for that, and we welcome your comments and feedback. Participating on this webinar, whether you're an SQF user or not, we really want to hear your feedback on that. And so with that, I'll close the webinar. We already exceeded our allotted time frame. For those questions that weren't answered, feel free to email myself or Brian, and we'll get back to you with those answers. So thank you very much for participating in the Learning Lunch today. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. And as always, thank you for your support with SQF. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.